Shalom Yerushalayim, Shalom Yerushalayim, Shalom Yerushalayim, Shalom Yerushalayim, Shalom, 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 Shalom Yerushalayim. Of Jerusalem, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, pray for the We continue our series on the highlights of the life of the Messiah from a Jewish perspective. And we now come to point 3 on your outline under the section of the conflict with the Mishnah, or over the Mishnah. And we come to a section in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7 that is normally referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. It's not a bad title. The problem with that title is it only tells you the geographical division or section where he was when he gave this message. He was on the Mount. But it says nothing about the content. So what I've done on your outline is give you a different name, his interpretation of the Mosaic Law, because that at least tells you more about the point and content of the Sermon on the Mount, the interpretation of the Law of Moses. How this plays a part of the Messiah's conflict with the authority of the Mishnah. Before we move into the actual content of the Sermon on the Mount, I want to do some introductory work in 2 areas. First of all, I want to discuss the historical background that led to the statements he makes here. Then secondly, we'll answer the question, what is the Sermon on the Mount as a unit? And once we've discussed those 2 points, we'll survey in a very basic way the point of this sermon. First of all, the basic background. At this point of time, an intense interest has been stirred up in the claims and the message of Jesus. But now he's had more than one major preaching tour throughout the land of Israel as he went from city to city, synagogue to synagogue, proclaiming himself to be the Messiah, as we noted in the past, authenticating his claims with many miracles and signs and wonders. Now, this was a period of Jewish history when the Jewish people were looking for the Messianic redemption. And they knew from the Old Testament prophets that whenever the kingdom is established, righteousness would characterize that kingdom, and righteousness would be the means of entering the kingdom. And now, over the preceding several centuries, Pharisaism had developed, offering them a form of righteousness which was a wide way to righteousness, because as we already noted in Pharisaic teaching, all Israel has a share in the age to come. And now Jesus is coming along, and he's clearly portraying a very narrow way into the kingdom. As we know it, what is taught with Nicodemus, that to enter the kingdom one had to believe in his messiahship. They had to come to believe that he is that messianic Son of God. And so his way of righteousness is a very narrow way. And the question that this raises among the masses is this: will Jesus authenticate Pharisaic Judaism? Is Pharisaic Judaism, their righteousness, sufficient for the Messianic kingdom? And if it is not, then what kind of righteousness is essential for the kingdom? Now, from that perspective, the key verse to understand the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount is in chapter 5 of Matthew, verse 20, that reads as follows: For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven. With that one statement, Jesus repudiates Pharisaism on 2 counts. First of all, he repudiates it as a proper righteousness for entering the Messianic kingdom, but secondly, He repudiates Pharisaic righteousness as having the kind of righteousness which is necessary for that Messianic kingdom. So that is the background in which this is being given. The time the Sermon on the Mount is given, it is after he has closed the apostolic group of 12, as any harmony of the gospel shows. He just closed it in the preceding context. It comes after there has been this very intense interest stirred up in the person of Jesus. And it comes after there's already been some initial conflicts between him and the Pharisees over the authority of the Mishnah. The second thing by introduction is to discuss what exactly is the Sermon on the Mount. And what I mean by that, as a unit, as a package, what was the intent of the Sermon on the Mount? Let me answer first of all by giving three negatives, three things it was not, and then we'll see what it is positively. First of all, it is not the constitution of the Messianic kingdom. This is the way it has been interpreted in some circles, but that was not its intent. It was not intended to be the constitution of the Messianic kingdom. If that was its intent, it would mean that in the Messianic kingdom there'd be a total reinstitution of all 613 commandments of the Mosaic Law, and that will simply never happen again. The second thing it's not a way of salvation. This is commonly taught in more liberal groups of more liberal Christianity, where they try to avoid the concept that Jesus is the only way to God, that his faith in him is the only way to salvation. So you heard them saying, if you keep the high ideals of the Sermon on the Mount, or more specifically, if you keep the golden rule, you'll make it to heaven. Even if anyone could keep the golden rule consistently throughout his life, he still won't make it to heaven, because salvation is always by grace through faith apart from works. So it is not a way of salvation. It is a rule of life for those already saved, but not a way or means of gaining this salvation. The third thing it is not intended to be church ethics or Christian ethics for this age. Now I mean that as a unit. Now he does say things in here, let it do become church ethics, Christian ethics for this age. You know what does or does not by what is repeated later in the Gospels or by the apostles and the epistles. But as a unit, that was not its intent. Because if this was Christian ethics for this age, what it would do is obligate all believers today to keep all 613 commandments of the Mosaic Law, because that is part of the Sermon on the Mount. As he will tell us, you must keep even these least commandments. But what commandments is he talking about? The commandments of the Mosaic Law. In other words, if this was intended to be church ethics, you would be obligated to keep all of the commandments. And what that would mean for the average Christian today is no more ham on rye, no more bacon and eggs. Here in Hawaii, no more kalua pig either for the luau's. You wouldn't be allowed to have any of these things under the Mosaic Law. But there's more than just eating or not eating. For example, if you don't have tassels in the corners of your garments, you are violating the Mosaic Law, because the Mosaic Law required it, and this is part of the Sermon on the Mount, and therefore you will be violating the Sermon on the Mount. If you're a man and you happen to shave when you get up this morning, then you have broken the Sermon on the Mount. If you do have a beard, but your beard is round and not squared or cornered, you again have violated the Sermon on the Mount. If you wear any clothing made of mixed threads, you violated the Sermon on the Mount. So again, this Sermon on the Mount was not intended to be Christian or church ethics for this age, though he does say things in here that later are to be taken that way. So these three things it's not. It's not the constitution of the kingdom, it's not a way of salvation, it's not church ethics for this age. So what is it? As a unit, the Sermon on the Mount is the Messiah's interpretation of the righteousness of the Mosaic Law in contradistinction with the Pharisaic interpretation of the righteousness of the law. Again, as a package, this is the Messiah's interpretation of the righteousness of the Mosaic law in contradistinction with the Pharisaic interpretation of the righteousness of the law. And the issue boils down to this: did the Mosaic law only require external conformity, or did it require both external and internal conformity? Now, with that background, let's take a closer look to that part of the sermon which is in your notes. And again, if you don't have these notes, they're available from Ariel Ministries. We begin with verses 17 through 19, where Jesus spells out his purpose in the law. He did not come to destroy the law of the prophets. Now the Pharisees, through their traditions, had the effect of destroying the law of the prophets, but he came to fulfill the law and the prophets. He came to fulfill the law as it is written, not the way it has been reinterpreted by the Pharisaic leaders. And indeed, he was the only Jew ever lived that kept the Mosaic law perfectly. So he kept the law perfectly. And he goes on to say in verses 18 and 19 that everyone is obligated, that is, every Jewish person is obligated to keep the entire Mosaic law down to its least commandment, meaning all 613 commandments of the Mosaic law. Now keep in mind that when he makes these statements, it comes before his death, and the Mosaic law does not end with the coming of the Messiah. It ends with the death of the Messiah. As long as he was alive, it was obligatory for every Jewish person to keep even the least commandment. And the issue here is what's involved in keeping the Mosaic commandments. Some people use this passage today and say we have to keep the law because he said so here. But this was only true while he was alive. Even those who do say that, they're very inconsistent, because they begin to revamp the law, to rewrite the law, to rearrange it, to reinterpret it. So even Moses would not even recognize his own law. And having said that's absolutely necessary to keep even the least commandment, that's when he makes that statement we looked at earlier in verse 20, that righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. So verses 17 through 20 is basically his introduction to what he wants to say. Then you notice how certain verses in Matthew chapter 5 begin. Verse 21, you have heard that it was said. Verse 27, you have heard that it was said. 31, it was said also. 33, again, you have heard that it was said. 38, you have heard that it was said. 43, you have heard that it was said. Now, if the issue is the point of the Mosaic law, then the formula is, as you see it elsewhere, it is written. But if the issue is the point of the Pharisaic law, then the formula is, as you see it here, you have heard that it was said. In a previous study, we noted the history of the development of Pharisaic law and pointed out at this point it was still all oral, the oral law. None of it had yet been written down. And so this is something they heard since it had not been written. So if the issue is the written law, it is written. If the issue is the oral law, then you have heard that it was said. And what he does throughout the Sermon on the Mount is pick out a Mosaic commandment. And he shows the contrast between their interpretation of the righteousness of this command against his interpretation of the righteousness of this command. For example, in verse 21, the first example he gives is that of the law of murder. And the law says you must not be guilty of premeditated murder. In the Pharisaic interpretation of the righteousness of this command, you were not guilty of violating this command until you commit the act of murder. But Jesus says that's the wrong interpretation. Now it's true you do not violate the letter of the commandment until the act is committed, and you cannot be punished by the law until the act is committed. But here we're talking about the righteousness of this command, and the righteousness is broken even before the act is committed. So as he says, as soon as someone begins to develop internal animosity towards someone, he is developing a hatred that could lead to the act of murder. Whether it does or does not, once that animosity is there inside, the righteousness of this command has already been broken. You'll notice at the end of verse 22, he says, anyone that shall call his brother Raka. Raka is a Hebrew word that means you empty head. As soon as you call somebody you empty head, in any sense of animosity or hatred, one is already developing an internal animosity, which could lead to murder. But even if it does not lead to murder, the righteousness of this command has already been broken. The second example in verse 27 is that of committing adultery. And the Mosaic law said, you must not commit adultery. In the Pharisaic interpretation of the righteousness of this command, again, you are not guilty of violating the righteousness of this command until the act is committed. Here again, Jesus says that's the wrong interpretation. True, you do not violate the letter of this command till the act is committed, and you cannot be punished by the law and stoned to death until the act is committed. But here again, we're dealing with the righteousness of this command, and the righteousness is broken before the act is committed. And Jesus says, if anyone looks at another woman with lust who is not his wife, then he's already violated this commandment. So as soon as somebody begins lusting after someone that is not his wife, the internal lust has already broken this commandment. And whether it does or does not lead to the act of adultery, the righteousness of the commandment has been broken. And so on throughout the whole Sermon on the Mount, they say this, I say that. They say that, I say this. And he contrasts his interpretation with theirs and their actions with his actions. When he gets to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, we come to, in your outline, verses 24 through 27, and here he gives the Jewish masses a choice. They can continue building on the Pharisaic interpretation of the righteousness of the law, but this would be building upon a foundation of sand. Any structure built on that foundation will collapse. Or they can build on his interpretation of the righteousness of the law. That will be building upon a foundation of rock. Any structure built on that foundation will survive. At the end of it all, we read in verse 28 of Matthew chapter 7, it came to pass when Jesus ended these words, the multitudes were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, not as their scribes. Now, if you want to know how the scribes taught, you only have to look at 2 or 3 pages of rabbinic ancient literature. Over and over again, the formula is always the same. Rabbi so-and-so said, in the name of Rabbi such and such this. Rabbi such and such said, name of Rabbi so-and-so that. Every rabbi always taught on the basis of previous rabbinic authorization. But Jesus quotes no rabbi, no scribe, no Pharisee. He interprets the law as one who has the authority to interpret it. As the Messiah who gave it, he indeed had that authority. So by the time he's finished with the Sermon on the Mount, the people clearly understand what he is saying, and more important, they clearly know where he differs with the scribes and the Pharisees. Now again, as a unit, as a package, the Sermon on the Mount is his interpretation of the righteousness of the Mosaic law in contradistinction with the Pharisaic interpretation. But also as a unit, it's one more thing. It is his rejection of Pharisaic Judaism. And as his rejection of Pharisaism, that will now lead to their rejection of his messianic claims. It now brings us to capital D on your outline. We have the rejection of the Messiahship of Jesus. You notice there are 2 parallel accounts in your notes of this event in Matthew 12 and Mark chapter 3. I'll stay primarily with Matthew's account since he's the more detailed of the 2, but we'll have to make references back to the Markan account for now and then to make another point. But capital D in your outline, then we come to the rejection of the Messiahship of Jesus, point 1 being the rejection itself. And now let me make 2 points from Mark, and then we'll stay with Matthew. First of all, in Mark's account, verse 21, we're told, when his friends heard it, they were not to lay hold on him, for they said he is beside himself. His own friends recognize a high point is about to be reached. They do not recognize the nature or the significance of it. And they just observe that Jesus is acting differently than the norm. In fact, they feel that his zealousness is bordering on insanity and needs to be rescued from himself. As they say, he's besides himself. The second thing to note in Mark's account is verse 22. Exactly how this incident is instigated. We read, and the scribes which came down from Jerusalem. The event takes place up in the Galilee, 3 days' journey away from Jerusalem. But the incident is instigated by scribes which came down to Galilee for this purpose from Jerusalem. It means that the second Sanhedrin stage of investigation, the stage of interrogation, is now complete. They have reached their verdict. They're now looking for an opportunity to make the verdict public. With that background from Mark, we're going to stay primarily in Matthew chapter 12. In verse 22, we are told that Jesus cast out a demon that caused the person controlled to be dumb or to be mute so that he could not speak. Now, the act of casting out demons in of itself was not particularly unusual in this day and age. Even the Pharisees and the rabbis and their disciples went around casting out demons. Jesus even says as much with his own challenging question in verse 27, by whom do your sons cast them out? But within Pharisaic Judaism, for one to cast out a demon meant he had to use a specific ritual, and this ritual had 3 specific steps. Number 1, the exorcist would have to establish communication with the demon. When a demon speaks, he uses the vocal cords of the person he controls. Secondly, after establishing communication with the demon, he would have to find out the demon's name. Thirdly, once he knew what the demon's name was, could he, by using that name, order the demon out? There are other occasions we find Jesus using that very same Jewish method. And one example is in Mark chapter 5, where Jesus was confronted by a demoniac. So Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And the answer he received was, "My name is Legion, for we are many." In the context of Mark 5, Jesus used that standard Jewish approach. But because of that same 3-step procedure, there was one kind of demon they could do nothing about, the kind of demon that caused the person controlled to be mute or dumb so that he could not speak. And because he could not speak, there was no way of establishing communication with this kind of a demon, no way of finding out this demon's name. And so within the framework of Pharisaic Judaism, it was considered impossible to cast this kind of a demon out. But the rabbis have been teaching long before this time that whenever the Messiah comes, he will even cast out dumb demons. Here is the second of those 3 Messianic miracles we talked about earlier. The first one was the healing of a Jewish leper. Now we have a second one, the casting out of a dumb demon. So to cast out other kinds of demons was not messianic. To cast out a dumb, mute demon is messianic. Here again, once we understand this point, we'll better understand why things happen the way they do. Now, in verse 22, that's exactly the kind of demon that he cast out. So notice the question this raises in verse 23. And the multitudes began to ask the question, "Is this the Son of David?" That's a messianic title. What they're asking is he the Jewish Messiah? Since he's doing those very things we have been taught since childhood only the Messiah would be able to do. Now, while the Jewish multitudes were willing to raise the question, they were not willing to answer the question for themselves. Instead, they're looking to the leaders, the Pharisees, to make that decision for them. Throughout our history, the people have tended to labor or belabor under a complex which I call the leadership complex. Whichever way the leaders go, the people are sure to follow. Now we see this frequently in the history of the Old Testament. We read over and over again, when the king did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, the people followed. But when the king did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, the people also followed. Even in our day, when we who are Jewish believers testify about the Messiahship of Jesus to our Jewish context, sooner or later they tend to raise the same objection. And the objection is, if Jesus really was the Messiah, how come our rabbis don't believe on him? In New Testament times, as we've already shown in this series, because of the stranglehold that Pharisaism had upon the masses, this leadership complex was very strong. So while they're willing to raise the question, is this the son of David, they're not willing to answer it all for themselves. They're looking to the leaders to answer it for them. And in light of all that's happening, the Pharisees are now stuck with only two options. First option is to proclaim Jesus to be the Messiah. That's the obvious one. The second option is to reject his messianic claims, but if they do take that second option and reject his messiahship, they will at the same time have to be able to explain away how come Jesus can do those things they themselves had labeled to be uniquely messianic things. In verse 24, the Pharisees do take the second option. They do reject his messiahship. And then to explain away his special abilities, they claim that he himself is possessed, not by a common demon, but by the prince of demons, Beelzebub. Now, the word or name Beelzebub is a combination of two Hebrew words that mean the Lord of the Flies. This became the official Pharisaic basis for the rejection of the Messiahship of Jesus. He's not the Messiah on the grounds of being demon-possessed. This is not only found in the Gospels, it's found in later rabbinic literature as well. There is one place in the Talmud that says that the reason Jesus was executed on the Passover is because he seduced Israel by the practice of sorcery. And there is a close connection between sorcery and demonism. They had to explain how come he was executed on a feast day which went contrary to Jewish practice, and they excused it by the enormity of his crime, connecting it with demonism. There's another place that says that when Jesus was down in Egypt, he made cuttings in the skin of his flesh and inserted into his skin the four-lettered name of God. In Hebrew, God's name comprises 4 Hebrew letters, and by inserting this 4-lettered name of God, he was able to do all these special miracles. Neither in the Gospels nor in rabbinic literature do they deny the fact of his miracles. That would be hard to do in light of so many witnesses. But they always ascribe his power to a demonic source, as they do here. So again, the official basis for the rejection of the Messiahship of Jesus was that he is not the Messiah, but he did what he did on the basis of demon possession. And that will help to explain the enormity of the sin that Jesus is about to talk about. Now Jesus responds in verses 25 through 27, making his defense. And in his defense, he points out 4 things. First, in verse 25 and 26, this accusation simply cannot be true because it would mean a division in Satan's kingdom. Secondly, in verse 27, they themselves have been teaching that a gift of exorcism is a gift of God. So to accuse them of this now makes it inconsistent with their own theology. Thirdly, in verse 28, this miracle actually authenticates the claims and the message of Jesus in his claims of messiahship. And fourthly, in verse 29, this miracle shows that he is stronger than Satan. He is not subservient to Satan. And after defending himself with these 4 points, in verses 30 through 37, he now pronounces a special judgment upon that generation of Israel for being guilty of very unique sin, the unpardonable sin of the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. And because this sin is exactly what he calls it, unpardonable, judgment is now set against this generation, a judgment that can under no circumstances be removed or alleviated, a judgment that will come 40 years later in the year AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Now we should make it very, very clear in our minds exactly what the unpardonable sin is in the context in which it is found, and mind you, this is the only context in which this sin is found, and we must interpret every verse by the context in which it is in. And based upon this context, we can define the unpardonable sin as follows. By way of definition, the unpardonable sin is the national rejection by Israel of the Messiahship of Jesus while he was present on the basis of being demon-possessed. I'll repeat. By way of definition, the unpardonable sin is the national rejection by Israel of the Messiahship of Jesus while he was present on the basis of being demon-possessed. Now, from that definition, I want to make four clear ramifications. The first ramification is that this is a national sin. It is not an individual sin. Even individual members of this day and generation could and did escape the judgment by becoming believers in his messianic claims and escape the judgment in ways I'll talk about when we come to the end of this particular series. Nor is it a sin that any individual could commit today. It was not individual to begin with, and furthermore, the Bible does make one thing very clear. Regardless of what sin anyone commits, every single sin is forgivable to that individual that will come to God through the blood of the Messiah, and the nature of the sin is irrelevant. When Jesus died on the cross, he did not just die for some types of sins, but not for others. He died for every type of sin, rendering every type of sin forgivable to that individual that will come to God through his blood. But for the nation, as a nation, it is now unpardonable. The second ramification is that this is a sin that is unique to the Jewish generation of Jesus' day, and it cannot be applied to later Jewish generations, as church history has often tried to do. It was to this particular Jewish generation that he visibly, physically came, offering himself as Israel's Messiah, offering himself the Messianic kingdom, and it was this generation that rejected him. From now on in our study, we're going to keep seeing two words coming up over and over again. This generation, because it's this generation alone that's guilty of this unique sin. The third ramification is this is not a sin that some other nation could commit today, because Jesus is not now visibly, physically present with any other nation, offering himself as that nation's Messiah. That was unique to his relationship to Israel, a relationship he has to no other nation but Israel. So it's unique to Israel and none other. The fourth ramification is that a commitment of the unpardonable sin by this generation for this generation meant two things. First of all, it meant that the Messianic kingdom he had been offering up until now is rescinded. They have lost out on seeing the kingdom established in their day. Therefore, the kingdom is rescinded. It is destined to be re-offered to a future Jewish generation that will accept it, which will be the Jewish generation living in the Great Tribulation, something Matthew himself will detail in chapters 24 and 25 of his book. But this particular generation has lost out on the privilege of entering the Messianic kingdom. The second thing it means for this generation is they are now under a special type of judgment, a physical judgment of death and destruction and a worldwide scattering, a judgment that will come 40 years after these words were spoken in the year 70 AD. Now, this is the third time in biblical history that a specific Jewish generation reaches the point of no return and is subject to physical judgment. The first time this happened was in the book of Numbers, chapters 13 and 14, the sin of Kadesh Barnea. Kadesh Barnea is an oasis right on the border of the Promised Land. So once you went past Kadesh, you were in the Promised Land. From that oasis in the Promised Land, Moses sent out 12 spies, and they came back 40 days later. And they all agreed on one point. The land was all God said it was, land flowing with milk and honey. But then came a sharp point of disagreement. 2 of these 12 men said, because God is with us, we have an all-powerful God, we can take the land. But 10 of the spies said, because of the numerical strength and military strength of the inhabitants of the land, under no circumstances can we take the land. And there was a massive rebellion against the authority of Moses and Aaron. The 2 men almost lost their lives in a mob scene until God intervened. At that point, God entered into judgment with his people because this was the 10th time there was an act of provocation against the will of God. And the judgment was that all those who came out of Egypt would now have to continue wandering in the wilderness until a 40-year period is over with to correspond with the 40 days the spies spied out the land. And during those 40 years, everyone who came out of Egypt, except for the 2 good spies and those below the age of 20, would die out in the wilderness. So that 40 years later was a brand new nation, a nation that was born as free men in the wilderness, not as slaves in Egypt. They were allowed to enter the land under Joshua. Now, it meant that that generation, the Exodus generation, reached a point of no return and lost out on the privilege of entering the Promised Land. And they forfeited the opportunity to go in. It would be the next generation, the wilderness generation, will be able to enter the land under Joshua. Now, chapter 14 of Numbers goes on to say God did forgive their sin. It did not affect anybody's individual salvation. Again, we're talking about a physical judgment, not a spiritual judgment. So again, Numbers 14, God did forgive their sin. It did not affect their spiritual salvation. However, they had to pay the physical consequences of this act of rebellion. Even Moses had to die outside the land as a divine discipline because of an act of sin he committed, but it did not affect his spiritual security, his salvation. So we must distinguish between spiritual judgment and physical judgment, and we are dealing here with a specific type of physical judgment. And the Exodus generation reached a point of no return. And what that means is that no matter what you do thereafter, it cannot avoid the judgment. And the Exodus generation did repent, and God forgave them, but it was too late to avoid the consequences. The second time this happened was during the rule of Manasseh, one of the most cruel kings that ever ruled the city of Jerusalem. The streets of the city flowed freely with blood during his rather lengthy reign, and he turned the temple compound built for the glory of the God of Israel into a major center of idolatry. And finally, a point of no return was reached, and God decreed the judgment of the Babylonian destruction of the first temple and the city of Jerusalem and the Babylonian captivity. No matter what happened thereafter, it could not avoid that judgment. And indeed, we are told Manasseh did repent. He was a spiritually saved man. And he was followed by the rule of good King Josiah. But God simply said he won't bring on the calamity in their day. A point of no return was reached. No amount of revivals, and there was a lot of revival under Joshua, could change the fact of coming physical judgment. A point of no return had finally been reached. Now for the third time, here in Matthew 12, a point of no return is reached by a specific generation. Nothing they do after this can change the fact of coming judgment. And indeed, in the triumphal entry, thousands and thousands will proclaim him the Messiah of Israel. They'll cry out, "Blessed is the Son of David, blessed is the kingdom that comes, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord," which in its Jewish frame of reference was an official messianic greeting. And literally thousands and thousands of Jewish people are proclaiming him to be that messianic king. But no matter what they did after Matthew 12, it was impossible to change the fact of coming judgment. So even in the context of the triumphal entry, in the context of messianic acclamations, if you look at Luke chapter 19, verses 41 through 44, the words of the Messiah remain words of physical judgment. A point of no return had finally been reached. So that brings us to point 2 on your outline, the new policy concerning his signs. After listening to these words of rebuke and judgment, in verse 38, the Pharisees tried to retake the offensive by demanding yet another sign. The implication is he hadn't done enough to authenticate his messianic claims. By the time this event takes place, he had performed numerous miracles, including those same miracles they labeled as messianic. In spite of this, they rejected him, and so now Jesus announces his new policy concerning the purpose of his miracles. As we noted in earlier part of this study, when Jesus began his public ministry, the purpose of his miracles were to serve as signs to Israel, to get Israel to make a decision concerning his messianic claims. Now this decision has been made and has been made irrevocably. So in verse 39 and 40, he now announces his new policy and says that for the nation there will be no more signs except one sign, the sign of Jonah, which is the sign of resurrection. Now obviously he performs many miracles after this event, but the purpose of his miracles change, in that no longer is the purpose to serve as signs for the nation. Rather, the purpose is to train the 12 disciples for the new kind of work they'll have to conduct because of this rejection, the kind of work we find them conducting in the book of Acts. But for the nation as a nation, no more signs except one sign, the sign of Jonah, the sign of resurrection. And that sign will come to Israel on 3 occasions. First will be the resurrection of Lazarus. Secondly, the resurrection of Jesus. Thirdly, the resurrection of the 2 witnesses in Revelation 11 in the Great Tribulation. Only the sign of resurrection will remain a sign for the nation. After announcing this new policy concerning the purpose of his miracles, he once again picks up the theme of judgment. But now notice the special emphasis upon that particular generation. Verse 41, the men of Nineveh will stand up in the judgment with this generation and shall condemn it. Verse 42, the queen of the south shall rise up in the judgment with this generation and shall condemn it. Jesus now brings in the example of 2 Gentile examples from the Old Testament, the men of Nineveh and the queen of Sheba. Now these were Gentiles who had a lot less light to respond to, but they did respond to lesser light. And so the great white throne judgment, these Gentiles would be able to stand and condemn this particular Jewish generation for being guilty of the unpardonable sin. The words of judgment then conclude with a story of another demon in verses 43, 44, and 45, though the point of the story is often missed. It deals with a demon that was indwelling a man, living in him, but then chose to leave. He was not cast out. He left in his own free will, looking for a better apartment in which to live. He searches for a while, but when he could find no vacancies, he decides to go back to the person who was indwelling earlier. And upon his return, he finds that person swept, he finds him garnished, but verse 44 also says he still finds him empty. because in this interval period where the man was freed of any demonic indwelling, he was not indwelled by some other spirit, be it the Holy Spirit or some other demonic spirit. So because he remained empty, this demon is able to come back in. But he does not want to live by himself anymore. So he invites 7 of his buddies to join him. And Jesus says in verse 45, the last state of that man is become worse than the first. At first there was only 1 demon. Now because he stayed empty, there are 8 demons residing in him. But the point of the story is made in the last phrase of verse 45. Even so will it be also unto this evil generation. And notice carefully the emphasis upon that particular generation again. Now when this generation began, it began with the preaching of John the Baptist. And the calling of John was to prepare them for the acceptance of the Messiahship of Jesus. And by means of the preaching of John, this generation was swept. This generation was garnished. But now with the rejection of his Messiahship, this generation also remains empty. And because it remains empty, the last state will be worse than the first. At first, under Roman domination, they had to pay annual tribute to Rome. But Rome allowed them to retain a national entity. Jerusalem was standing. The temple was functioning all of its Herodian glory. But 40 years after these words were spoken, the legions of Rome invade the nation. After a 2-year siege, the city is destroyed. The temple is torn down till there is not one stone standing on top of another. And the Jewish people dispersed and scattered throughout the world. And so indeed the last state of that generation did become worse than the first. And to this day, the dispersion is with us. The fact that Jewish people living here in Hawaii, elsewhere in the world, the fact that I was born in Siberia, Russia, became a believer in Brooklyn, New York, educated in New Jersey, Ohio, and Texas, now living in California, is indeed a picture of this worldwide dispersion. Now, point 3, the results and consequences of the rejection of the Messiahship of Jesus. And there are 4 specific results. And these are 4 major changes in his ministry, because now his ministry changes. It changes radically. It changes in these 4 areas. Number 1 is a point we already made, which has to do with the purpose of his miracles. And that from this point on, the purpose is no longer to serve as signs to Israel to get them to make a decision. The purpose of miracles from now on is for the training of the 12 apostles for the later work. The second change has to do with the people for whom these miracles are performed, and there are 2 facets to the second change. The first facet is that until this event, he went around performing miracles for the benefit of the masses. He did not require them to have faith first. John 5 is a good example, the healing of the man at the pool of Bethesda. And he simply approached the man on his own initiative and healed the man. The man did not even know who Jesus was. Later, when he was asked who healed you, he didn't know. He had to go back and find out. He didn't know who Jesus was, didn't know who he claimed to be, and there was no faith involved, obviously, from that context, because at that point, faith was not essential. At that point, the purpose of his miracles was to get them to believe. But that changes after Matthew 12, and from now on, he performs miracles only by responding to needs of individuals, and this time he will require them to have faith first. The second facet, the second change, has to do with the people for whom these miracles are performed. Until Matthew 12, when he healed someone, he told him, "Go and proclaim what great things God has done for you." But after Matthew 12, every time he heals someone, he tells them, "Don't tell anyone what God has done for you." He initiates a policy of silence. And those who benefit from his messianic power are forbidden to tell anyone about it. He shifts from telling all to telling no one. The third change has to do with the message that he and the apostles will now present. Until Matthew 12, both he and they went all over Israel, city to city, synagogue to synagogue, proclaiming this one to be the Messiah. But after this event, whenever he instructs them, he tells them, don't tell anyone that he is the Jewish Messiah. For example, Matthew 16, when Peter makes his famous statement and says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus then tells Peter, don't tell anyone I am the Messiah or the Christ. And they too must follow this new policy of silence until it is rescinded in Matthew 28 with the Great Commission. The fourth change, which brings us to your notes again, the point 3 there, has to do with his method of teaching. Until this event, when he taught the masses publicly, he always taught them clearly and distinctly in terms that they both could and did understand. As we saw earlier in this hour, the Sermon on the Mount, and we noted that when he was finished, the people clearly understood what he was saying, and more important, they knew where he differed with the scribes and Pharisees. But after Matthew 12, every time he teaches publicly, it's always parabolically. And we see this here in Matthew chapter 13. Whenever he teaches the people publicly, it's always in parables only. And verse 1 tells us it began the same day as the rejection. And Matthew 13, verse 1, on that day when Jesus out of the house, on what day? On that day, the same day as the rejection occurred. And verse 3 says, he spake to them many things in parables. The parabolic method of teaching began the same day as the rejection. And when the disciples asked Jesus, why has he begun teaching them in parables? Matthew verse 10, the disciples came and said unto him, why speakest thou unto them in parables? The question implies that this is the first time he began doing this, otherwise they wouldn't bother asking this question. And Jesus answers there are two reasons for the parabolic method of teaching. The first purpose is for the disciples, and for them the purpose is to illustrate the truth. But the second purpose is for the masses, and for them the purpose is to hide the truth, to teach them in terms they cannot and will not understand. Because by now sufficient light had been given to them to respond correctly, and they responded incorrectly with the unpardonable sin, and so now no further light will be given. Now, if you look at Matthew's account, verse 34, notice what it says. All these things spake Jesus in parables unto multitudes, and then note, without a parable spake he nothing unto them. This is not a true statement before Matthew 12, but it is absolutely true after Matthew 12. Every time he speaks to them publicly, it's always parabolically, so that they cannot and will not understand. Now look at Mark's version, because he adds a detail that Matthew chose to leave out. And in Mark verse 33 we read, with many such parables spake he the word unto them as they were able to hear it. And without a parable spake he not unto them. This much we knew from Matthew, but Mark adds, but privately to his disciples he expounded all things. And this will be his consistent method from now on. When he's teaching publicly, it'll be parabolically, so no one can understand. Then when he's all alone with the disciples, he'll explain the meaning of these parables, because for them, the purpose is to illustrate the truth. It's impossible to understand why his ministry changes so radically in these four areas. Let's understand how crucial the events of Matthew 12 are. And I would say the events of Matthew 12 are by far the most important events in the life of the Messiah, with the exception, of course, of his death and resurrection. The events of Matthew 12 set the stage for the second half of his ministry. It sets the stage for the events coming up in the book of Acts. It sets the stage for a new entity to come into being, the ecclesia, the church, the body of the Messiah, and sets the stage for Jewish history for the next 2,000 or so years. It's a very clear turning point. And as we continue this study in the subsequent studies, I'm going to point out some of these places where these changes occur. They're all over the place, but we are dealing with a highlights version of my course on the life of the Messiah, and so we'll just have a lot less examples, but we'll see examples of this new change. And that will begin next time.